All right, thank you. It's great to be here. Great to be back in person again, seeing people in 3 dimensions. A long time during the pandemic, but I think we learned to do a lot. I think we got a lot done, and we're resilient, right? So it's an honor to be selected for this. I represent a lot of people, though, in standing here today, and many students. I think it was about 8 years ago that I went to the GeoPlenary conference in Geneva. I met Peter there. I met Florian Poppenberger and others from the WMO that really started us down this path of developing GeoGloWS. And since then, had many brilliant students that have come and been part of this. Jorge Luis Sanchez is one of the PhD students at BYU, current one, who's done fantastic work. And he didn't say this, but his wife is actually the one who's extending. She's now getting her master's degree. She's home with their children and watching them. She couldn't be here, but she's the one that's extending his work on the bias correction to do water level data, which I think will be really an outstanding contribution in converting these forecasts from discharge to water level. And you can, just from the last presentation, you can see that in most places they really need water level. Ultimately, a map, which we're also working on, and you've seen many different presentations, and these are things we're working on as well to extend these forecasts into maps. So I also want to mention NASA. The people in NASA Applied Sciences through the Severe program and the Water Resources program have been a huge part of helping develop this and collaborating, and there's many others. And I always like to begin a presentation with a picture of my family. And if you don't remember anything else about my presentation today, remember this slide. And when you go home, be sure that you thank your most important co-PI. Mine's actually here today. My wife, Laurie, do you want to stand up for a minute? I'll embarrass her. And really, during the pandemic, we had to learn how to function at home and get along again. And my wife's heard all of these technical terms by Zoom as I sat in one room and she was busy in the other room. So I thought it would be fun to bring her here, let her meet. But if it weren't for her and all that she does with my family, then it wouldn't be possible to do the work. And I know that it's the same for many of you. And so I encourage you to remember to go home and thank the most important co-PIs in your life. All right. Jorge did a great job of overviewing GeoGloWS. He was in Colombia this last month, and I was back in Provo. We were down in Brazil and Colombia the first part of August in our work down there, and then we were apart. So I didn't know what he was going to say. We didn't see each other's presentations till we got here, but I'll just briefly review a couple of things I know he summarized. We began our project with GeoGloWS really by working with Peter, with the group at ECMWF. We used the same forecast. Originally, GloFast was using Hessel as well, I think, in starting in version 3. Sean reminded me that starting version 3, they're using the full list flood. They do list flood routing. This is actually a typo here. We used, as Jorge said, a Muskingum routing through a program called Rapid. That's a very rapid way to map the runoff in the grid cells to local or sub watersheds, and then we route that using Muskingum routing. And by doing that, we're able to provide the response at on nearly 1 million points throughout the world. And so that has increased the density of reporting points, essentially, of what is the ECMWF runoff forecast. And then the other thing that we have done with that is converted into a service so that it's accessible electronically. It's 2 primary products. There's a mapping service working with ESRI, ESRI. They host on their Living Atlas an animated mapping service that can be incorporated into many different applications. And then we also have a data service for the historical and the forecast that can be accessed, and then they can be combined in many ways. We use a TEPIS platform, which is an open source web application development software. A lot of the applications that you see are done with TEPIS. but they can be incorporated in any kind of web mapping environment. So this is the web mapping service. It shows thickness of line in terms of magnitude of discharge, and then color relative to the historical simulation. Then we can determine whether it's an extreme event or not. The data service has two primary products. You can access the historical simulation from ERA5 and also the current daily forecast, ensemble forecast, as Jorge mentioned. And again, the real what's really helped make this data useful at a local scale is providing it through an API. So this shows the different functionality. The results are processed, and then this data can be downloaded. It's a REST API. There's also Python interfaces so that the information can be gotten on your specific stream and then used and combined in ways like, as Jorge mentioned, with local data. So you can see it also allows us to customize this at the national level or regional watershed scale, whatever scale you want. And this has been important to get adoption in countries, the Amazon countries that Jorge mentioned, because they're now able to validate, compare, get confidence in the information through the validation methods that Jorge has mentioned, but also then present it as theirs in a way so that they have confidence in using it as opposed to going to a global resource, which even though it's the same data, it's packaged in a way that gives greater confidence for use in their environment. So we've done this then, as Jorge mentioned, in the Amazon countries, and they've connected that to their observed discharge and now observed water level data so that they have operating systems within their country. Some of them also operate their own models. In Peru, for example, Tsunami has a national scale model. They ultimately took the same delineation of streams and basins and then operate their model. It's only, I think it's a single deterministic member over 3 days, but now they can combine that with their own local modeling in order to do that. So these are just the different implementations. You can see that we just barely put metrics and so that we can see where it's being used. Some of our work with the World Bank in India, we found out that they picked this up right away. We had no idea. There's some group up in Russia. We're not sure exactly who they are, but they figured out how to access. We hope that we're interested in finding more about them, and then you can see over different parts of the world, specifically in South America, in South Asia, where we've done a lot of work as well. All right. So part of this award came because of a use case in Malawi, and our colleague from Severe, who is part of the water resources expert in the hub, Severe Hub in East Africa. They learned because of our other work in Severe about the data service, and so they implemented this as part of a project they had. And this slide kind of shows our general philosophy in trying to help use global data and make it usable and accessible at a local level. And I've worked for many years in the Dominican Republic, in Latin American countries, in trying to help build capacity. And often what the projects do is they come in with global data, global modeling information, and then you have to construct a local model and calibrate it, use your own information, have the computational resources to do that. And that's a really important effort that increases capacity, but too often it's not sustainable in terms of the financing, the upgrading the systems, software, hardware changing all the time, and human capacity at many of these institutions is just not sustained in order to keep these kinds of efforts going. And so what we really looked at doing with VCMWF, with what GEOGloWS is doing in those forecasts, was being able to take that information and then make it accessible as a service so that they could leverage also the many improvements that are always occurring from these experts in the global data. I used the example of Google Earth. In the original days, those images were spotty. They were there was a lot of clouds, low resolution, and over time, though, they become improved all the time. And I believe that's the same thing is happening in global hydrologic modeling as well. And it's only going to improve those feeds and allow them to take advantage of that. So in Malawi, our colleague Calvin Swara, who is a water resource expert in the Severe Hub, they had a project to work with the Malawi government in these vulnerable areas to provide a community-based early warning flood system. And so they've identified these 8 districts, flood-prone districts in Malawi. They wanted to use their telemetric stations, but also leverage satellite and global data in order to strengthen the capacity and ability for decisions to be made there. So their initial system was developed with telemetric data, and they had several gauges along the system, and then the warnings were produced from that. So they had a system of downloading that information and then looking at water levels. They would provide a trigger flood warning, but this only provided hours of lead time based on the gauges that were provided. So what they wanted to do then was take the API from the GEOGloWS system, and at those same locations, they could then get the 15-day forecast, ensemble probabilistic forecast, and be able to have increased their warning from a few hours to days, where they could begin to watch, and then correspondingly, as the storms occurred with their telemetric stations, have those warnings produced and alarms triggered. And so that was used. There was a Cyclone Anna in January that came through there, where they had this system already in operation and going. They were able to provide, based on the forecast that came from the GEOGloWS, they were able to give an advanced warning of like 3 or 4 days instead of just several hours of this warning. And in fact, they did have the floods that came through there. There was a lot of press about how the early action helped save lives and money and infrastructure. It's hard to quantify exactly how much. I mean, clearly, even without advanced warning, they would have been taking some kind of action. But we know that having this kind of preventative actions is a tremendous benefit in terms of increasing the likelihood that, or decreasing the likelihood of lost lives and property. So now they're following this. They're working at now implementing it in several other districts. And Calvin's recently presented in another forum in Africa. I think there's several other countries in that region that are looking at being able to combine with their local telemetric systems these global forecasting. And so that was I think the genesis of really getting the user award. But as I said, this really is a representation of the work of many, many people from ECMWF, from this group, from NASA, my colleagues at Esri, and then many students like Jorge Luis that have made that possible. A couple of other implementations. I mentioned the Dominican Republic. This is an area that I've worked for many years, and they have also integrated this with their system. We have worked with the WMO in helping to manage these local observation data. So they have their WHOOS hydrologic observation system in order to bring that local data with standards so that we can connect it to the global model and satellite data to improve those systems. During Hurricanes Eta and Iota in Honduras, we got a call from their government because they essentially lost a lot of their telemetric information. Were going blind on the second hurricane. And so we were able to help them. It performed very well and help them manage their reservoir storage to eliminate some of those problems. I've done a lot of work in Hindu Kush, and I think Lori is going to talk a little bit more about some of that work in South Asia and the customizations that they have made. We also found a colleague who picked this up in Israel. He now provides the bias-corrected engaged data in both Israel and the Gaza area, where they have very little infrastructure and capacity to be doing forecasts. And so they use that for their early warning forecast system as well. In Inami, we've implemented not only the GEOGloWS, the streamflow forecasting, but the other tools from WHOOS. We're working with Severe and projects to do mapping for for water, and then forecasting really what by correlating the GEOGloWS discharge with flood maps, we can then use a correlation in order to predict essentially what a satellite would see. And so we're implementing those systems and helping establish the capacity for INAMI to provide in the water sector in their country. Finally, AWS, recently we're working with them so that we can help them. They're going to sponsor the computational and data management resources for developing countries to be able to implement these kinds of tools and provide that for at least a couple of years while we optimize what the sustainability of using these cloud resources would be in order to allow them to have these tools. CBFEWS, as I mentioned, allows these kinds of applications to be shared. So a lot of the things that have been developed, in fact, I was telling Jorge that one of the groups in West Africa has developed also an interface to the FANFAR program that was just recently mentioned, so that we can combine these tools and share across different implementations in these different areas. And so AWS is going to help us hopefully scale up the dissemination and the sustainability of these kinds of activities. And with that, I will end.
This will take a minute to warm up. Thanks so much. That's awesome work going the last, what I call not the last mile, but the last 1,000 miles that actually take to get people to use trust and information. Awesome. That's a cool story. Questions for Jen? Oh, Maggie. I'm going to go upstairs first.
Okay, thanks for the presentation. So there's now 2 global systems that are, being used more and more, GEOGloWS and GEOGloWS. So if the government would ask me as a consultant, like, what should I use? What would be your response to that?
Well, my response is use either, use both. I tend to think of GEOGloWS really as low fast, but reporting at a higher resolution of locations. It's the same forecast that comes from ECMWF. And in fact, when Jorge mentioned the bias correction, really the main driver is that meteorological forecast that's coming. There are some differences. I mean, originally when we started, GLOFAST was using the same Hessel, and we did a lot of comparisons at the GLOFAST reporting points and what we were doing, and essentially it's the same forecast. The routing, there are some minor differences. So I've always viewed GEOGloWS really as GLOFAST. We've made it so that it's a higher density reporting location and as a service. And but there are a lot of, I mean, I don't know, and Peter, maybe you could, or Sean, if you want to say anything, add to that. But I think they're really the same thing. We really tried to stay true to that because we know there's a lot of confidence in people in using GLOFAST. What we've tried to do is make it a service and make it more accessible without trying to deviate really from that original implementation.
Well, maybe just to respond to this, I can imagine there could be one important difference, but I'm not sure, and that's a really important stage in forecasting. It's also the storage in lakes and wetlands, like the larger stores, significant stores. Is there a difference there?
There, and I guess I'm not sure exactly what GLOFAST is doing in terms of the routing through the storage. I know you do have reservoirs and some of those things are implemented. Some of the larger ones, I'm guessing not all storage, right? And that makes sense, especially where GLOFAST is intended more on a larger scale for larger transboundary watersheds. Well, but I will say that what has happened with the work that Jorge Luis has done, he didn't mention this, but when you do the bias correction, the observed data will track exactly what's happening upstream in terms of storage and the way that it's managed. So what we have found is that when you actually do that bias correction, you're correcting for that operation in the reservoir. And so we actually end up reflecting a lot of that. And again, it illustrates the value that can be added by making the data accessible, that you can do those kinds of things with it. Yeah.
Just to hop in there. So I think, in the question is not whether either which one you would like to use. In my view, I mean, we all know that no meteorological forecast, and that includes then also any hydrological forecast, is perfect. So what we want, what we should be able to try and aim at giving to our users is the broadest basis possible for decision making. In my ideal world, I would take what I can get and try and make sense out of it. And that includes taking also various hydrological forecasts, because that's what's done in meteorology as well. A lot of the meteorological services don't rely just on one forecast system. So that would be my my addition to that question.
So when you show the case, the application case for Malawi, do you know how the local first responders communicate with the local people in terms of delivering like warning system data to the local people? I mean, I don't know if they have access
I know
to the
that,
internet, or like how do they communicate basically with the local people?
I know that part of that's SMS texting that goes out, but I do not know all the details of how the warning trigger, what happens after the warning trigger. But I know that part of it is sending text message warnings out, but I don't know if it goes to the whole population or to others on the ground who then help share it.
Go ahead.
And then, yeah, you know if GEOGloWS is being used to do any financing anywhere, or is it more secret?
No, I mean, I think that that's the hope. We've been, I've worked a little bit with Andy and the Red Cross. We've had some projects, and we've always envisioned that this kind of system could enable that. I think even from the presentation, it's still, I think that's still early in terms of learning how to do it, the confidence in doing it, and how to make it work. But, you know, we felt like this is the kind of thing that might help agencies be able to do that better.
All right, last question.
Thank you. Thanks for your presentation. I think it's really impressive what you've done and the impact that you're making, and also how many parties you managed to bring together. And I was wondering, what is your long-term vision on how to finance such a web service? In the end, you're offering a global web service. Do you think it's best to charge user in the end to get subsidy on a global scale? Or what's your long-term vision on that?
Cool. That's, you know, every night I say my prayer. And this ran for a long time on servers at BYU, and gratefully, because of the use and the impact, you know, ECMWF now runs it on their services. We've had AWS now step forward. I wish I could say that somebody was going to, you know, shower down a lot of money and fund it. We hope that kind of the service continues to make sense, that, you know, that it will get funded. But I honestly, we've tried many, World Bank, you know, we work a lot with them through the GEO program, but GEO doesn't have a lot of financing. But hopefully the exposure there will bring in maybe from member states and ways that, you know, they're seeing the impact. But I honestly wish I had a big donor or somebody that would just kind of wish that.